3 true horror stories involving coworkers that will haunt you. I tell these as plainly as I can, because the plainness is part of what makes them worse. These were not movies. They didn't happen in an alley at midnight or on a back road. They happened at fluorescent-lit desks, behind deli counters, in an office while a storm raged outside. Ordinary places, ordinary people, and then a line was crossed. By the end of each story, something simple, a laugh, a knock, a shard of glass, kept replaying in my head long after the immediate danger had passed. If you work with strangers, or you have ever shrugged off small, awkward behavior as nothing, listen. These 3 stories are true. They involve coworkers. They will haunt you. The first one comes from an internship. I was 20, still saying sir at the wrong times, learning how to hide how little I knew about spreadsheets. We were in an open-plan finance office where the ceiling lights hummed and the air smelled faintly of reheated lunch. Cubicles were low enough to see across, but tall enough to feel a little private. People left jackets draped over chairs and coffee mugs with motivational quotes. It should have felt safe. It didn't. Alex was another intern, pale, a little too close to the edge of socially awkward. He was the kind of person who didn't know where to put his hands, who asked the same question 3 different ways until you answered him the 4th time just so he would stop. Nobody thought much of him at first. He came in early, left late, and made strange comments in a voice that didn't quite match the words. At his desk, he hawked a weird, slow grin as if he were holding on to a private joke. That grin made people inch away. At first, his behavior was small. Oddities you could excuse as quirks. He'd pop his head up over the cubicle wall like a periscope to ask a question, and people would go back to typing. He had a way of stretching vowels in a sentence that made ordinary talk feel performative. He'd say things like, "You ever noticed how the rain sounds like a clock?" in the middle of a spreadsheet review. People laughed politely. People are bad at confrontation when the alternative is discomfort. The escalation was subtle at first. Small invasions that felt too intentional to be coincidence. He started dropping by my cubicle more than anyone else's. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that you noticed the pattern when you put the days together. He'd hover at the edge of my workspace, asking to borrow a pen, to look at a document, anything that gave him an excuse to linger. The grin stayed. The voice stayed. It started to feel like a performance directed at me and only me. There's a peculiar terror in realizing someone is watching without permission. You don't want to overreact. You don't want to be the person who makes a workplace uncomfortable for everyone else.
So I did what I thought was reasonable. I avoided him, kept conversations short, tried to let managers handle it if it escalated. They did step in eventually. After a string of complaints, not just from me but from others who had felt the same creep, Alex was fired. There was a round of relief at the office, that brittle kind of relief you get when something awkward leaves the room. The routine resumed. The fluorescent hum went on. The motivational mugs stayed. And for a few weeks, I felt free. Then, in the middle of a quiet night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I stared at it, thumb hovering, willing it to be some telemarketer. I answered because the noise of a ring in an otherwise quiet apartment is its own kind of alarm, and because it felt safer to hear a voice than to let silence creep into the space. The voice on the line was Alex's. It had been a while since I'd heard him speak outside of a cubicle, and the voice on the phone wasn't the voice he used in conversation. It was slow, elongated, as if he were savoring each syllable. He said, in a tone that might have been meant to sound poetic but landed like a threat, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water." Then he laughed. It was high and frantic and buoyant in a way that didn't match the way people laugh when they're pleased. It was the sound of someone who had reached a private conclusion about control. My palms went slick. I hung up. I checked the locks. I sat in the dark and listened to the refrigerator hum like it was a building breathing. You think firing someone ends it. You think firing someone draws a bright line. It didn't. Weeks later, at 5 in the morning, I woke up because I'd heard someone calling my name softly outside my window. It was the sort of call that didn't carry far, a thin, personal sound meant to be heard only by the intended person. When I looked through the blinds, the sky was still that thin gray before sunrise, and Alex was standing in the backyard, under the bare tree, hands in his pockets, smiling the same frozen grin. There's no textbook for what to do when the person who has been making you uncomfortable shows up at your home. I called the police. They came. They asked the usual questions. Had I given him my number? Had there been threats? Did I feel immediately unsafe? They listened and they filled out a report. They were constrained by what the law and evidence allowed. They gave practical advice. Lock your doors, change your routines, and they said what they always say in these situations: report anything new, preserve any evidence. But in the moment, there's a limit to what a report can do. Alex was arrested that day, briefly, and the company formally distanced itself. That's the institutional response. Document, detach, remove. It helps in the ways it can. It doesn't fix the rest. Not long after the backyard incident, Alex disappeared. I never saw him again. That should have been the end. But it wasn't.
The laugh followed me like an aftertaste. I would be at my desk at a new job, and a sound would cut back into my memory, the same manic ripple of air, and my chest would tighten. I stopped keeping my curtains open in the evenings. I checked my back fence twice before letting the dog out. I would wake in the dark and flinch at ordinary noises. That laugh had become a hook behind my eyes. The thing that feels worst in hindsight is how ordinary it all started. Awkwardness, a laugh, a pop of a head over a cubicle. Not signs of imminent danger, so much as signs that someone's social map is wrong. But wrongness can calcify into persistence, and persistence can escalate to violation. I accepted a job offer elsewhere and did not go back to that office. I didn't have to. The image of him in the gray backyard, calling my name with the tide metaphor, and that laugh, stayed with me. It still does. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. We have 2 more that are even harsher. The second story is from a grocery store in a small town. I was 17, and my shifts were full of the hum of fluorescent lights and the clink of canned goods. There's a kind of intimacy that happens among people who stock shelves and ring up the same faces day after day. You learn the regulars. You learn their complaints. You learn the rhythm of the place. You also sometimes learn more about coworkers than you want to know. Sean was older than most of us, maybe by 5 or 6 years. He worked the overnight stocking sometimes and the register other times. Outwardly, he was polite, quiet in a way that made him easy to overlook. He was the kind of person who would show up with a hoodie and a newspaper and start stocking without making small talk. But outside of work, there was a different side. He started interacting with me through a group chat we all had for scheduling and casual banter. That's where most work conversations lived then, a shared thread of memes and last-minute shift swaps. It felt normal, and at 17, I thought I had the world figured out. The trouble began when Sean started sending messages directly to me rather than in the group. They were the sort of messages that tried to be casual but landed as intrusive. He would ask what time I got home after my shift, what shows I watched, who I hung out with. Once, I mentioned a show in the group chat and thought nothing of it. The next day, Sean came in early and asked me in front of a coworker about a particular scene as if he'd watched it too. I remember the sudden flattening of the air around me, the way my smile felt fake. Where had he seen that? I hadn't told anyone else. Then the window tapping started. It was an oddity that makes sense until it doesn't. At night, in my apartment, I would hear something at the kitchen window, 3 soft taps. A neighbor's branch, I told myself. A squirrel. But the timing became too precise. It would be when I was about to lock up for the night, or when I was folding laundry, little taps that seemed to check where I was. Once I pressed my ear to the glass, because curiosity is a terrible thing, and heard someone walking away down the path. The sound of shoes on gravel. That sense of being surveilled in your own small space is worse than direct menace, because it suggests lingering, patient attention. When I told the manager at the store, they listened. For all the talk about communities protecting each other, institutions often have to balance privacy, labor rules, and legal procedure. The manager told me to take my shifts that would keep me near coworkers, to not accept rides from anyone I didn't trust, to file a formal complaint if anything continued. I did. The complaint was filed. Sean lost his job after the manager confronted him about the messages and his behavior. The store wanted to protect itself and its employees. That's the corporate side of things. Quick action to remove a potential hazard. The message that haunts me most is the one he sent after I told him I wasn't interested. He wrote, "Good luck changing your address." It wasn't an explicit threat the way a movie would make it, but it had a quality of ownership, as if he was reminding me that he knew more about my life than I wanted him to. He knew the pattern of my days.
He had seen me arrive and leave at particular times, and he had the unconscious entitlement of someone who believes that attention equates to permission. I went to the police and filed a report. The process was clinical and slow, and the officers were careful to frame my options clearly. This is a report. This is a chance to document behavior. We can assist if something further happens. I obtained a restraining order eventually. The process felt like paperwork that erected a distance measured in legal terms more than immediate comfort. It worked in a tangible sense. He had to stay away. It did not erase the nights I replayed the 3 taps and the feel of someone having logged me into their head. For months after, I kept my curtains closed and slept with the light on in the kitchen. I would call my sister on the way home just to hear another voice. I stopped taking the back alley home and started walking with my head up and my phone out. There is a hidden cost to having your boundaries violated. Your footstep patterns change, your friend circles change, your sense of ease shrinks. The restraining order gave me a legal boundary, but not the same internal sense of safety. There were moments years later when I heard a car pull behind me and my heart jumped into my throat before I realized it was a taxi. The fear had left a residue. Sean moved away at some point. He was never violent in a way that police could charge beyond harassment. He left, and the day smoothed out.
But the memory remains sharp in particular instance. The tapping pattern, the unreadable face behind the glass when I peered out, his last message that implied I couldn't really leave what he had put into his head. It's the kind of thing you rehearse politely when you have to, and then lock away, because the lesser harm still takes work to heal from. If the first story taught me that firing someone doesn't necessarily end their attention, the second taught me that legal boundaries can be enforced, but the internal aftermath lasts. You move on. You carry these small acts of violation like pebble-sized anxieties in your pocket. Sometimes they rattle when you try to sleep. The last story is the one that, even years later, makes my skin hitch when I remember the sound of rain. I was 26 and working the late shift at a small insurance office. We were the kind of company that serviced local clients and kept late hours during busy periods. That night a storm rolled in. Not the polite rain of grocery store tapping, but a heavy, relentless rain that hammered the windows and made the streetlights blur into streaks. The kind of storm that turns the city into a place of softened edges and makes any small sound feel enormous because everything else is muffled by rain. Tom was new. He had started a few weeks earlier and didn't say much. He was quiet in meetings, slow to respond in group email chains, and he tended to perch around the reception area where a second person made me feel less alone on a night shift. He was reliable in the basic sense, took calls, filed forms, made sure things were tucked away by closing. But he had a way of looking that lingered longer than was comfortable. In the fluorescent emergency lamp glow, while the office flickered in and out as the power stuttered, his gaze felt like the one constant. The storm made everything worse. Power cuts create a heightening of senses. The fluorescent lights would sputter, and then a red emergency lamp would throw a thin circle of light across the carpets, turning everything into silhouettes. Phone signals were patchy. Texts wouldn't go through. The hum that usually hung in the office disappeared and left a blank, which is a different kind of noise, the noise of possibility. You start to notice the ordinary things, the squeak of a rolling chair, the scent of wet coats hung by the door, the way thunder makes footsteps seem farther away. At some point, I realized the front door had been locked from the inside. That is a particular moment that will always stay with me, trying the handle and feeling it give with a slow, mechanical certainty, then realizing the latch was set and I could not get out that way. My first instinct was not to suspect malice. My first instinct was practical. Maybe it had been a maintenance decision. Maybe we had to keep the night secure. But then I went to check the office camera feed. It was offline. The little logs that usually showed who had swiped in and out were blank. My phone went dead. That blankness in the technology felt like a gap in which anything could happen. Tom was there. He had been there the whole time. He watched me walk to the door with a kind of measured patience I couldn't place. In the emergency light, he looked almost sculptural, as if someone had modeled a person around the shape of silence. When I asked him whether someone had locked the door for security, he smiled and said it must have been stuck. Confusion folded into discomfort. I went to the supply closet for a moment, thinking to call the manager or at least hide until someone else came back in. Hiding makes sense in a primal way.
It feels like taking yourself out of the field of danger, but it also reduces the options for escape and leaves you depending on luck or timing. I closed the closet door behind me and crouched among paper reams and spare pens. The closet was smaller than it had seemed when I was stocking shelves during the day. The air tasted like cardboard, and the damp smell from the rain seeped in through the seams. Then I heard him moving down the corridor. Slow steps. A pause. A soft breath. The kind of searching sound that makes your ears ring. I thought about calling out, about making noise, but then remembered the power. The silence was magnified. My heart pounded so loud it felt like an accusation. I stayed quiet. I watched the door hinge in the gloom and counted to myself to keep from hyperventilating. When I made my move, it was not because I had a well-thought-out plan. It was because fear became action. I flung the closet door and ran for the back exit, my shoes slipping on wet tiles, the thunder turning my breath into its own percussion. The back exit was chained. I saw it from under the emergency light, a thick chain across the door, looped and locked. My chest constricted. I doubled back, and as I rounded the reception desk, the front glass exploded inward with a sound like an animal. I saw the shards spray across the floor, silver teeth catching the red light, and for a half second I thought of every horror movie escape scene at once. My legs moved before my brain could choose. I bolted past the broken glass and out into the storm. Rain hit my face like a slap. I ran without looking where I stepped, feet cutting into puddles, the thunder swallowing sound. When I looked back, because of course you look back, there was no one on the sidewalk. Tom's car was still in the parking lot with the keys in the ignition, as if whoever had left it had simply walked away. That detail lodged in my mind the way a splinter lodges in skin, small, precise, impossible to ignore. Police came. They took statements, dusted for prints, looked at the damaged glass.
They found that the office cameras had been switched off for a period of time before the incident, but whether that was negligence, a technician's error, or something more purposeful, the records didn't make clean. Tom's employment status was reviewed. He left his job. There were questions in the police reports about his visits and movements, but nothing conclusive tied him to a crime that could be prosecuted beyond property damage. That legal gray area is infuriating. It lets you hold an image, a door locked from the inside, a car idling, and not have the closure or explanation you want. I quit that job within weeks. I couldn't make myself go back into that building, not because the threat was overt, but because the memory of the emergency light and the broken glass kept replaying. There's a kind of survival instinct that rewires you after an incident like that. You stop being able to see office spaces as benign obligations and start seeing them as potential traps. You make long-term changes, change employers, change routes, maybe even change roommates, because you don't want to live next to a place that looks like a scene in which you were almost trapped. In the months after, every heavy rain put me on edge. I would stand at the window and watch the headlights smear past and feel the old adrenaline flicker like a dying appliance light. The shattering of glass is a sensory memory more brutal than a scream. It's a microscopic symphony of endings. Sometimes I replay it and try to imagine other endings. What if the chain had held? What if the door had not given? What if someone had been waiting? None of those imaginations help. They only expand the corridor of what-ifs. The three stories have similarities and differences, but all of them share a brutal common ground. A person who should be a coworker becomes a presence that intrudes into the private sphere. The workplace, a place where you expect to exchange labor, to share gossip, to pass time, suddenly opens into a vulnerability. The institutional responses were predictable and imperfect. Firing, police reports, restraining orders, investigations. They did what they could within rules and evidence, but they could not erase the memory or the aftershock. None of the endings were cinematic finales. None offered the tidy justice we wish for. Instead, there was paperwork, distance enforced by law or the simple logic of not going back, and days that took longer to feel ordinary again. If there is a lesson, it is less about how to handle every specific scenario and more about honoring the small things your body recognizes before your mind has a label. People dismiss weird. They call awkwardness quirky. But a pattern, a smile that lingers, a presence that follows, messages that don't stop after you refuse, is not a compliment or a misunderstanding. It is a map of where boundaries have been ignored. Trusting your discomfort is not paranoia. It is a pragmatic survival skill.
Get help, document, involve authorities, and lean on others. Those are sensible steps. They do not guarantee a neat resolution. They do, however, create a record and put distance between you and a person who has shown they might not respect your limits. The scariest thing is how trivial the starting points were. A head popping above a cubicle, a late-night text, a quiet presence while the lights flicker. Those small motions are what make the horror so mundane. You look back and see how easily ordinary gestures became harbingers. I still hear the laugh from the first story when a neighbor laughs too loudly in the hallway. I still pause at a window when something taps on the glass 3 times. I still find my hands clenching at the memory of glass scattering on a rainy night. Those are the things that haunt me now. Sounds, images, the flicker of a light. They are not supernatural. They are echoes of boundaries breached. If any of this resonates with you because you've been through something similar, please share your experience in the comments. If this video mattered to you, subscribe so you don't miss other stories like these. And remember, what starts as awkwardness can become violation. Trust your instincts. Document what you can. Reach out for help. We live in places that are supposed to be ordinary. Sometimes ordinary becomes the seedbed for fear. The laugh that startled me awake, the 3 soft taps at the window, the spiderweb of broken glass under an emergency light, those small things are the scars that will keep me honest about safety. They will keep me watchful. They will haunt me. And if you work with strangers, they may haunt you too.